I'd like to call our second panel up, Nick Steinberg, a Mexico researcher with Human Rights Watch, Santiago Aguirre, a human rights defender with Tlaquinolan, am I saying that right? Human Rights Center in La Montana, Mexico. We are especially grateful to Mr. Aguirre for making the trip from Mexico to testify at this hearing and for his courageous work as a human rights defender in Mexico. And Maureen Meyer, a senior associate for Mexico and Central America with the Washington office on Latin America. And again, thank you all for being here. And I think this is an important subject, and I think we need to be talking a little bit more about it here in the Congress. And hopefully, this is the start of some more in-depth discussions. And we'll begin with Mr. Steinberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You just got to press the
and thank you for organizing this hearing on addressing human rights in Mexico. My name is Nick Steinberg, and I'm the Mexico researcher for Human Rights Watch. The remarks I will share today draw upon over 2 years of research in Mexico. I will first lay out our research on widespread abuses and impunity in Mexico's counter-narcotics efforts, and then I will put forward recommendations for what the U.S. government can do to help Mexico address these serious problems. A principal finding of our research is that Mexican security forces, as you pointed out in your introduction, have committed widespread abuses in combating cartels. Our recent report, Neither Rights Nor Security, documents more than 230 cases of killings, torture, and disappearances carried out by soldiers and police. These include cases from 5 different states and involve every type of security force deployed in the war on drugs: the Army, the Navy, and the federal, state, and local police. The patterns of violations we documented provide strong evidence that these are not isolated cases. Rather, they are examples of abusive practices endemic to the current public security strategy. For example, we have found compelling evidence in 5 states of the systematic use of torture by security forces. We reached this conclusion based on findings that torture occurs using the same specific methods, electric shocks, waterboarding, sexual assault, asphyxiation, under near identical circumstances after the victim is detained and in the act of committing a crime, in the same locations on military bases and in police stations, and for the same purpose, to coerce confessions or obtain information. Another principal finding of our research is that virtually none of the soldiers and police who commit these abuses is held accountable, in large part due to systematic flaws in the investigations. We have documented scores of egregious lapses by authorities in investigating human rights violations, including failing to collect evidence at the crime scene after executions, failing to perform legally required medical examinations of victims of torture, and failing to respond in a timely fashion to reported disappearances. While it is true that such shortcomings are evident in both the civilian and military investigations, these failures are particularly pronounced in the cases handled by military prosecutors. Mexico's military claims the right to investigate human rights violations under the Military Justice Code, which establishes an overly broad notion of offenses that fall under military jurisdiction. But the system is completely opaque, and military judges lack the independence and the impartiality to judge their own. As Kathleen Fitzpatrick mentioned, in July 2011, Mexico's Supreme Court ruled that all human rights violations committed by the military against civilians should be investigated in civilian jurisdiction. However, the practice in Mexico remains unchanged, as do the results. The Military Prosecutor's Office has opened nearly 3,700 investigations into human rights abuses committed by soldiers since 2007. Only 29 soldiers have been convicted for these crimes in military courts, less than 1%. Moreover, in none of the more than 230 grave abuses documented by Human Rights Watch in its recent report has a soldier, a police officer, or any other official been sentenced. Meanwhile, recent legislative efforts to reform the military justice system have stalled in Mexico's Congress, in large part due to pressure from the military. Human Rights Watch fully acknowledges that the Mexican government is confronting increasingly powerful cartels, which have committed horrific crimes against innocent people and officials alike. We recognize that the Mexican government has a duty to protect civilians from these criminal groups. However, the public security strategy to dismantle these cartels must be aimed at strengthening protections of human rights, not putting them aside in the name of combating organized crime. Why? Because each time civilians are abused, Mexican security forces undercut the public trust and the confidence that are vital to effective counter-narcotics operations, and only exacerbate a climate of violence, lawlessness, and fear across Mexico. So, what can the U.S. government do? As you mentioned, the U.S. has appropriated more than $1.6 billion in security assistance to Mexico since 2007 as part of the Merida Initiative. From the outset, Congress mandated that 15% of these funds would be withheld annually until the State Department issued a report that affirmed Mexico was meeting basic human rights requirements, including investigating and prosecuting military abuses in civilian jurisdiction and prohibiting the use of testimony obtained through torture. These requirements provide a critical opportunity to measure Mexico's human rights progress and to press the Mexican government to rein in these abuses. Therefore, it is first and foremost crucial that the U.S. Congress keep these requirements in place in future installments of the Merida Initiative. Second, in order to maximize the effectiveness of these requirements, they must be enforced. Yet despite clear evidence that the conditions have not met, and here I would disagree with the testimony that preceded mine, the U.S. has repeatedly released the conditioned funds. In the coming months, the State Department will produce another report for Congress on Mexico's compliance with the Merida human rights conditions. Based on our findings, as well as those of Mexico's National Human Rights Commission, the UN Special Investigators, and Mexican human rights groups, there is no question that Mexico continues to fail to meet these benchmarks. Therefore, unlike past Merida reports, the State Department should unequivocally conclude that Mexico is not meeting the requirements. And upon delivery of this report, the U.S. Congress should fulfill its duty to withhold the select funds until the requirements are met. Third, the State Department has announced that the next phase of the Merida Initiative will include increasing aid to Mexico's state and local governments and law enforcement bodies. Without a doubt, Mexico's local institutions are in dire need of training and resources, and the U.S. can play a constructive role in strengthening these bodies. However, it is essential that the U.S. government develop thorough vetting procedures to ensure that potential recipients of U.S. aid do not have a record of committing grave abuses with impunity. In closing, I would like to underscore that it is in the U.S.'s interest and Mexico's to address these serious problems, not only because it will help reduce horrific abuses and bring those responsible to book, but also because it is critical to remedying the long-standing flaws in Mexico's judicial and law enforcement institutions, and that will in turn make one of the U.S.'s neighbors and closest allies safer, more stable, and more effective in tackling mafias that have an increasingly global reach. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Aguirre, I want to make sure I'm pronouncing it. Tlaki Nolan, I get that right. My English is bad, so anything else I've learned. But we appreciate you being here, and we welcome your testimony.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. My name is Santiago Aguirre. I work as a lawyer in Tlachinolan Human Rights Center in Tlapa, Guerrero, in the south of Mexico on the Pacific coast. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. For the whole human rights movement in Mexico, it is very significant. Almost 6 years ago, when President Calderón declared war on organized crime, none of us could imagine the human rights impacts that this policy would have. More than 50,000 people have been killed, while the drug cartels are not losing their power. It is clear that President Calderón's policy is not the solution to the crisis of violence, but rather it has contributed to the violence itself. Moreover, it is false that Mexico faces a war between good and evil. In states like Guerrero, where I live, the line between the government and the criminals is many times hard to find. As Calderón's administration is coming to an end, it is time to evaluate the efforts made. With this aim, I will present 4 specific concerns from the human rights perspective. Our first concern is the use of the army as the centerpiece of the security policy. As a direct consequence of the war on drugs, human rights abuses committed by soldiers have been increasing dramatically since 2006. Complaints have risen by more than 600% comparing this administration with the previous one. The military deployment has never been accompanied by accountability. When soldiers are accused of human rights violation, the army keeps the cases under its jurisdiction, and the result is impunity. We've documented cases of rape and torture by soldiers that demonstrate this, such as the cases of Inés Fernández and Valentina Rosendo, in which, even though the Inter-American Court of Human Rights ruled in their favor, the soldiers responsible remain unpunished. Just 2 weeks ago, an important effort by our Senate Justice Commission to exclude human rights violations against civilians from military jurisdiction was abruptly ended when high-ranking Army representatives intervened with party leaders, so the Senate simply canceled the vote. Thus, victims still will have to fight in the courts to try to get their cases out of the military jurisdiction. This has happened in the Bonfilio Rubio case, for instance. Bonfilio Rubio was a young indigenous man who was shot and killed by the army in Guerrero in 2009 when soldiers fired at the bus he was traveling in as it left a checkpoint. Although President Calderon ordered the army to turn over these kind of cases to the civilian authorities, and even though a federal judge had determined that this case should not remain in the military justice system, in January, the army appealed the ruling defending its jurisdiction, and that's after the Supreme Court decision mentioned earlier. This case is now in the Supreme Court and may become the first binding sentence against the use of military jurisdiction for human rights violations committed against civilians. With its assistance, the United States must not forget that having the military and security tasks will produce human rights violations that will remain unpunished as long as the investigations are conducted in military jurisdiction. Our second concern is accountability for police abuses. The Army is not the only security force committing human rights violations in Mexico. Police officers at the federal, state, and municipal level are frequently involved in abuses, while internal and external controls are not in place to enable accountability. The federal police maintains these failures, as we have experienced recently in Guerrero, in a case that will allow me to talk also about our third concern, which is related with judicial reform. On December 12, 2011, in Chilpancingo, Guerrero, federal police officers, as well as state police officers, opened fire against the student protest, causing a violent riot that ended up with the killing of 3 individuals, 2 of which were young students. 168 police officers were involved, of which more than 90 had assault weapons, while none of the students carried firearms. What happened there reveals the truth about the federal police, a supposedly reconstituted force that has largely benefited from U.S. aid, frequently presented as the greatest achievement of Calderon's administration. Federal police officers, in fact, opened fire against unarmed young students, and after the event, the police did not cooperate with the investigation conducted by the National Human Rights Commission. So far, no member of the federal police has been charged. Reports of abuses by the federal police are getting more severe. This supposedly reformed police is repeating the same old patterns. U.S. assistance must consider that without enforcing accountability, institutional strengthening and new equipment will not be enough to build strong and democratic police forces in Mexico. This must include the federal police, but also investigative police at the state level, which is, as I said, our third concern. Troubles with investigative police are not new. Monitoring the police forces in La Montaña, we've registered almost 200 cases involving investigative police abuses in the last 4 years, which is more than 40% of all the cases that we've documented. But today, the investigative police in states like Guerrero is not only responsible for human rights violations, it is also deeply infiltrated by the drug cartels. The case I mentioned earlier is emblematic in this sense. After the violent assault against the students, 24 individuals were detained, and 20-year-old student Gerardo Torres Perez was severely tortured by Guerrero's investigative police officers. This young student recovered his freedom, but no one has been charged for the torture, in part because it is well known in Guerrero that some of the officers implicated in this case have strong ties with organized crime. In Guerrero and other states, the failures and corruption of the investigative police threaten to undermine the success of the judicial reform in Mexico. This reform, which, as you know, is strongly supported by U.S. assistance, will fail if the investigative police is not purged and reformed. Finally, I want to say a few words about victims, human rights defenders, and journalists' protection. Civil society is key to overcoming the Mexicans' violence crisis, yet its active participation is limited because of risks and threats. This is even more serious in states like Guerrero. For instance, Valentina Rosendo Cantu, whose case I mentioned, have to move several times after repeated threats in the last couple of years. Today, she lives in hiding. Regarding human rights defenders, Mexico City's Human Rights Commission stated a few days ago that this year 62 defenders have been attacked and 5 of them have been killed. We live under risk. Ending impunity for human rights violations is one of the best ways to build a strong institution. It is fundamental that U.S. continue to recognize the relevance of independent human rights work in Mexico. In this sense, hearings like this are extremely important. To conclude, Mr. Chairman, basic actions taken in this side of the border, like drug demand reduction or measures against high-powered weapon traffic into Mexico, can help to reduce violence. A social approach is also important, considering that in regions like the mountains of Guerrero, some communities grow illicit crops as a way to survive deprivation and poverty. Regarding U.S. assistance to the Mexican government, it is extremely important to push for long-term actions to strengthen Mexican civilians' institutions and to enforce accountability at all levels, especially monitoring closely emblematic cases. If not, U.S. assistance will be going to authorities that systematically violate human rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Meyer?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to thank you and the Commission for organizing this important hearing on the human rights situation in Mexico and for the opportunity to present my testimony. My name is Maureen Meyer, and I am the Senior Associate for Mexico and Central America at the Washington Office on Latin America. I wanted to start by saying that just last year, important reforms were made to Mexico's constitution that represent the most significant legal changes to protect, promote, and respect human rights in the country in decades. However, as my colleagues have stated, in spite of these and other efforts, human rights violations continue to be widespread and have increased in an environment that is made even more complex by the proliferation of organized criminal groups in the country. Organized crime in Mexico has severely weakened the state's ability to protect and promote human rights and uphold the rule of law. The same institutional weaknesses that have allowed organized crime to flourish in the country are also at the root of human rights violations by Mexican officials. Given this context, I want to focus my testimony on the Mexican government's efforts to implement institutional reforms to its police and justice systems as essential elements to create rights-respecting institutions that citizens can trust. First, on police reform. A centerpiece of Calderon's administration, police reform efforts have been measures to vet its police forces and establish trust control centers that carry out annual evaluations of police performance. While these exams can be an important tool to root out corruption, only 29% of Mexican law enforcement bodies have been evaluated, and of these, only 50% have passed their exams. Police experts have expressed concern about the over-reliance of these exams to vet forces. Cases have already surfaced where officers who repeatedly passed the exams were later investigated and prosecuted for links to organized crime. More importantly, the reliance on these exams focuses only on weeding out bad apples. It does not create or strengthen internal mechanisms that would address the institutional practices that have been permissive of abuses and corruption. Within the federal police, there's also an internal affairs unit. However, this unit has not been effective in addressing cases of abuse. Of the 8 cases of human rights violations by this force that were documented by Mexico's National Human Rights Commission in 2009 and 2008, no officer implicated in the abuses has been sanctioned. These cases involve violations such as arbitrary detention, torture, unlawful killing, and assaulting and robbing Central American migrants in transit in Mexico. It is true that compared to the previous federal police forces, this current police force, created in 2009, are better trained and equipped. However, the failure to implement strong accountability mechanisms has meant that the same human rights violations committed by police in the past persist today. In fact, complaints of abuse by the federal police have increased in number as the force has grown. In 2011, the National Human Rights Commission documented 767 complaints of abuse by this force, as compared to only 141 complaints in 2009. Because of the significant assistance provided to the federal police by the United States, it has a vested interest in ensuring that this new force is not undermined by a poor human rights record. We believe U.S. assistance should prioritize support for the development and strengthening of internal and external control mechanisms well beyond the provision of polygraph equipment and support for the National Police Registry. We further encourage the United States to determine ways it can support the new protocols published by the Mexican government that regulate the use of force and provide guidelines on the detention and transfer of detainees to the custody of prosecutors. Now, on justice reform, the ability to investigate, prosecute, and sanction effectively those who commit crimes is an essential element to ensuring the rule of law. Yet it is estimated that fewer than 25% of crimes in Mexico are reported, and, as has been mentioned previously, only 2% result in a sentence. Cases taken on by Mexican human rights organizations have further shown that of the people sentenced, many never committed a crime. As was discussed in Ms. Fitzpatrick's testimony, Mexico passed important reforms to its justice system in 2008 that should make the system more effective, efficient, and transparent. An 8-year transition period was established for the implementation of these reforms, but so far only 3 of Mexico's 31 states are fully operating under the new system. A full transition to this new adversarial system is important to strengthen the rule of law and gain citizens' trust in Mexico's judicial system. Currently, the states that are moving forward with the reforms are showing positive results, such as prosecutors who are being twice as efficient, fewer people being held in pretrial detention, and more cases being resolved through alternative dispute mechanisms. Nevertheless, even in states that have the reforms, such as Chihuahua, old habits die hard, and confessions obtained through torture continue to be admitted in legal proceedings. This is the case of Israel Azarte, who was detained by Mexican soldiers on February 3, 2011 in Ciudad Juarez and taken to a military barracks where he was beaten and tortured. Although he informed the judge during his arraignment that he had been tortured into giving a false confession, she refused to view the visible marks on his body and did not open an investigation into the torture and ordered that his trial proceed. Increased efforts to implement judicial reforms are essential to guarantee a more effective investigation and prosecution of crimes, including human rights violations. U.S. support for the judicial reform process has been instrumental in moving reforms forward at the state and federal level, and continued support is important to further strengthen the rule of law in Mexico. I think to conclude, I wanted to say that although legal reforms are important, it is essential to address the underlying factors within Mexico's institutions that will change practices and behaviors. Transparency and accountability, including internal and external control mechanisms, should be priorities for the Mexican government to prevent human rights violations and to hold abusers responsible for their actions. The United States should prioritize its future assistance on these areas. Finally, the United States should use the leverage provided by the human rights requirements in the Mérida Initiative and maintain these requirements in the 2013 appropriations bill. As my colleague has stated, withholding these funds until progress is made to meet these requirements, and we believe that they haven't, would send a clear message that the United States is concerned about the gravity of the human rights violations being committed in Mexico. The expansion of organized crime in the country has left thousands of victims and grieving family members. Because it has further weakened the government's capacity to guarantee human rights, organized crime also needs to be viewed as a human rights issue. As Mexico struggles to quell the violence and the United States continues to consider future security assistance to Mexico, it is important to remember that the same institutional reforms that are needed to address human rights violations are also essential in order to effectively deal with organized crime and violence. We believe it is in both countries' best interest to work to curb the systematic human rights violations being committed by Mexican security forces as an important way to strengthen the rule of law and citizen security in Mexico. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I want to thank all of you for your very powerful testimony. And Mr. Steinberg and Ms. Meyer, I tend to agree with you on the withholding of the 15% at this particular time. Because I think, if we're going to have conditionality in our laws with regard to human rights, they ought to mean something. And every time we waive them, because it's we don't want to get anybody angry, or it's convenient, I think it diminishes the importance of that conditionality. And and to the Mexican government, I would just say that if we were to withhold a certain portion of the aid at this particular point, they should use that as leverage to try to push forward reforms, because ultimately you don't want any conditionality. You don't want any aid withheld. So, I mean, we need to make it very clear that human rights is important. That's a centerpiece of our policy, and it's so important that if certain conditions aren't met, then we're prepared to hold some of the aid as provided for in law. So, Mr. Aguirre, I want to, again, thank you for being here. I know that it is not easy being a human rights defender in Mexico, and I know it's very dangerous. But I want you to know that we really appreciate you coming all the way up here to testify, and that we intend to stay in touch with you. And we hope that you will feel free to pick up the phone anytime you think we could be of assistance, because that's what this commission is for. So thank you for being here. I have a few questions, if I could. Hopefully the bells won't ring, but let me kind of go through them a little bit here. Mr. Steinberg, I guess my question is, why haven't more cases of abuses of civilians by military personnel been transferred to civilian courts? You mentioned that few had been, but I want to, what's the reason, and what's the biggest obstacle to transferring these cases to the civilian justice system, and what can the United States do to encourage that these cases be transferred?
In terms of the numbers of cases, as you point out, it's incredibly low. The last time we were in Mexico, last month, we met with the Home Ministry, and they said that 8 cases have been transferred out of about 4,000. Now, the argument that they make is that these 8 cases show a tendency, a shift in the practice. As far as we're concerned, 8 cases out of 4,000 is not a tendency, especially when the majority of them have been mandated by the Inter-American Court. Right. In terms of why they're not transferred, you mentioned earlier the question of will and the fact that the Army doesn't feel the pressure that they need to transfer them. The President has said publicly in 2 speeches on December 9th and on February 3rd that these cases should eventually be moved to civilian jurisdiction. And he's instructed the Attorney General, the civilian Attorney General, to work with the military Attorney General in the transfer of cases. So why isn't this happening? Well, when you talk to the Attorney General in Mexico, they still don't believe that they have jurisdiction over these cases. So they're not taking an active role in claiming jurisdiction over cases that the Supreme Court has given them the right to claim. So we both have the military on the one hand still saying that all of these cases belong in their jurisdiction, and also a civilian Attorney General and civilian prosecutors' offices that are complicit in this practice because they are not claiming jurisdiction over these cases. So both parts are in essence complicit in this. In terms of what the U.S. can do, Santiago mentioned that there was a very strong proposal that made it through the Justice Commission in Mexico's Senate to reform this system. The proposal was not perfect, but it fixed many of the biggest problems in previous proposals, including that Mexico had originally wanted to create special tribunals on the civilian side with ex-military members as judges, which would have essentially reproduced the system. This proposal was killed by the Mexican military's pressure on the Senate not to even vote on it. The best thing that can happen, and the way the U.S. could really apply pressure, is to get a solid proposal that complies with the Supreme Court decision and complies with the Inter-American Court decisions before the Senate and the House for a vote. That's the most important next step.
Do you think the United States is pushing hard enough or doing enough?
Well, one of the conditions of the Merida Initiative is very clearly that these cases be transferred. And every time that we say that Mexico is meeting that requirement, when in fact it is not meeting the requirement, we're not doing our part. So no, I don't think that we are doing as much as we can on the U.S. side.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, can I comment on that briefly? I think one thing we didn't talk about as much in the testimony is that the reason there's been a skyrocket in human rights violations by the military is their massive deployment in these counter-drug operations throughout the country under the guise of this is a temporary measure. We need the Mexican armed forces because our police are so weak. If you look at history in Mexico, this has been a pretext that's been used for at least the last 20 years to increasingly involve the military in public security tasks. So I think, again, in terms of a U.S. role, it's continuing them to encourage them to have an exit strategy of when you're going to withdraw the armed forces to these tasks that they're not trained to be doing and that have led to these massive human rights violations. So again, I think that shift in strengthening the police is very important, and then looking at how do you develop a strategy to remove the armed forces from this task.
When I hear that, I'm thinking of what's happening in El Salvador right now in terms of a similar situation where they're basically having the military do what civilian police should do, but that's a whole nother hearing. Mr. Aguirre, over the past few years, there's been an increase in attacks on human rights defenders. And who's perpetrating these attacks? And what steps can be taken to better protect human rights defenders in Mexico?
Well, according to the UN Office for Human Rights in Mexico, the cases that they have registered show that in most of the cases the attacks came from governmental officers. So it is important to state that because sometimes the federal government insists that the attacks on human rights defenders come from organized crime, but the statistics show that it is not like that.
The military, or when you say federal governmental officials, who are we talking about?
Federal government officials, but also state level officials and even municipal level officials. I think that to reduce risks against human rights defenders, it is very important to advance in the implementation of the mechanisms for protections, which have been already designed, but they are not being applied in practice. And it is also very important to monitor the investigations of the attacks that were already made. When a human rights defender attack remains in the impunity, it is a message that it is possible to do that without having any consequence. So I think it's very important to keep an eye on the specific cases of human rights defenders and journalists' attacks.
In your testimony, you described the extensive involvement of investigative police in corruption and human rights violations. What steps must be taken to effectively reform the investigative police?
Well, as Maureen Meyer said, the more strategic point there is to enable internal and external controls on the police to reinforce accountability. Today we don't have in Mexico mechanisms that allow police to be accountable for corruption, human rights abuses, but also for the crimes they are committing as long as they are being part of the organized crime schemes that are prevailing in Mexico.
Ms. Meyer, you mentioned this in your testimony. I guess, in your view, why has the federal government in Mexico been slower than many state governments in Mexico in moving forward with judicial reform? And what can the United States do to encourage judicial reform at both the federal and the state levels in Mexico?
I think the question before of the will aspect certainly comes into play. The federal government took almost a year to get their second technical secretary in place to actually support even the states in the reforms. And the federal, Calderón did not present until September of last year a new proposal to reform the federal criminal code of procedures. So I think it's been very slow in part because when Calderón introduced the original bill for the constitutional reforms, which was very important, what he wanted out of it as a priority were provisions on dealing with organized crime, which created a separate system for people accused of organized crime that installed a system that would enable detention of individuals for up to 80 days while you gather evidence against them, so not even being accused of a crime, but if you're linked to organized crime, to being held for that time period. So I think Calderón and the administration originally got what they first wanted out of the justice reform when it was enacted. It went into force immediately, and the reforms at the federal level weren't necessarily a priority. I think the U.S. has been providing important support, both obviously to the states, but to the federal government to encourage them to introduce a proposal for the federal code, but also the Department of Justice is starting to do more and more training of federal judges and prosecutors. So we would say that should continue, and I think particularly in the current context, the odds of having a federal code passed now before the elections in July or before a new president takes office in December are pretty slim. So it's, I think, approaching the next president of Mexico when he or she takes office in December to say, how are you going to make this a priority? I think, and none of the candidates have really been very firm in it being a commitment. So I think with the U.S., given the support that we've had for the justice system, to encourage the next administration to really make it a priority.
This is for any one of you or all of you. What's the single most important step the Mexican government could take to reduce impunity and increase accountability for human rights abuses? And what is the single most important step the United States could do to reduce impunity and increase accountability in Mexico? Simple question. And Mr. Steinberg, want to be with you, or do you? Or anyone want?
Go ahead.
Everybody's putting you on the spot first, though.
Okay. Well, look, I think a good place to start, because in Mexico, the government is quite good at designing huge initiatives and taking a lot of time to plan them and then falling off in the implementation. Perhaps the most effective place to start would be to pick paradigmatic cases that have been documented in part by any of the organizations that are here today, and investigate them well. The government could choose from many cases, but the numbers of actual effective investigations are so abysmal that even establishing accountability in a handful of high-profile cases would be very positive. And it's important that those investigations take place in the civilian justice system. There's a precedent for this. There was a case that was investigated in the civilian justice system of military abuse. It's known as the Castaños case. It's a case where things happen as they should happen. Military was investigated in the civilian justice system for having committed crimes against civilians. Now, that case is now several years old. If the Mexican government could pick cases where there are clear signs of the military having committed abuse, including cases documented by the National Human Rights Commission, and did a thorough investigation and held soldiers accountable on the civilian side, I think that would be a very positive first step. Now, what can the U.S. do to press that? I think we're probably sounding like a broken record here, but actually asking, instead of numbers on how many officers have been trained or how many workshops have been given, for results in terms of people being investigated and prosecuted. And when it comes to those numbers, there's just nothing to show.
Well, I agree. In order to reduce impunity, I think that it's crucial to...
Your mic on? Yeah. Okay.
I think that it's crucial to have reach success in emblematic cases that show that it is possible in Mexico to have access to justice, which is not happening now. And it is very important in that order to strengthen the prosecutor's office at the federal level and at the state level. Now, the institutions that are being strengthened are mostly the police at the federal level, mainly the police at the federal level, but the force of the prosecutor's offices is being not supported in the reforms that we are facing now. And I think that it is very important to keep in mind that it's due the size of the violence crisis in Mexico, training and legal reform will not be enough. It is needed to move forward into, for instance, monitoring specific cases, demanding the cleaning of the corporations, of the police corps that are proven to be infiltrated by the organized crime, like the investigative police in Guerrero. I think that's very important.
Meyer?
Not to repeat my colleagues, I think one obviously showing results.
Repetition is good here, because sometimes it sinks in.
Showing results on concrete cases would be a start, I think. And in terms of accountability, I think it's not just doing one-time purges of your forces. The Calderon government, in the beginning, there was a purge of the federal police, there was a purge of the customs agencies, there's been a purge of the Attorney General's office. They seemed a lot of times like one-time deals. We're going to clean up the force and then hope everybody that's in there now is better. I think it's more the long-term having better accountability mechanisms, having internal affairs that actually work and that are showing that people that commit abuses and crimes there are consequences for that, and that's not happening. So I think it's until those institutional issues are addressed in Mexico, you can have continual evaluations of police or purges, and it's not going to get to the root of the problem. So I think, again, how do you ensure that those are there? And I think that's where U.S. support is important in saying it's not just an issue of applying polygraph exams. It's a series of issues to really get at accountability. And our police forces, some of the good examples on how we worked on this and how we worked to root out corruption that would benefit Mexico. And I think on human rights, too, it's showing with willingness to withhold money. And you mentioned that as well as something that's important of we have conditioned our funding on performance on human rights and looking at using that as important leverage. So this needs to be happening in Mexico by showing results on specific cases and I think long-term change.
Mr. Steinberg?
Can I just wanted to add two small points returning to your question on police reform, because this keeps coming up, and also on what we mean when we talk about investigations of these cases. I think that it's important to say that there needs to be a balance and that all of us recognize that we need to build up a police that's trustworthy. But at the same time, the process in which that is done is very important. And we have cases in our report of these, what are supposedly model police purges, basically translating into police arresting other police and torturing them until they confess to being corrupt police. So it is very essential that in the police reform process, we not reproduce the same kinds of abuses that we're trying to weed out. That's one. And in a way, the same goes for the investigation of these emblematic cases. The case that Maureen brought up of Israel Arzate, which is a case from Juarez, his torture and the abuses against this man were produced by demands to produce someone responsible for a very high-profile massacre of teenagers in Juarez. He's an innocent man that was the victim of abuses because there were demands for justice elsewhere. So it is essential that as we demand that Mexico produce results in these cases, and this is the same as they produce results in police training, that they do it in a way that produces trustworthy institutions that doesn't violate the human rights of other people in the process.
This has been very, very helpful to me, and this is the first hearing I think this commission has done on Mexico, and it certainly won't be the last. And again, I would invite all of you to stay in touch with us if you have concrete suggestions of things that we should be doing. I'll just close by yielding the floor to any of you. If you want to have any closing comments, we'd welcome them.
I wanted to add, obviously, thank you again for the opportunity to speak and for this hearing. You had asked Ms. Fitzpatrick about U.S. arms trafficking issues, and I think that's something that we are working on, and we do believe, as you had also stated, there is a role for the United States in this. More information coming out of the ATF has actually said that 67% of the more recent weapons they've traced that have been submitted for tracing from Mexico have been traced back to the United States. So obviously
that's outrageous. I mean,
it's a big number.
That's something that's to me something that we have some control over, that we need to devote a little bit more time to up here. But anyway, I appreciate that.
I think obviously there's legislative issues, much more challenging politically, but it's even encouraging President Obama to do what he can within his executive power in terms of the ban on importation of assault weapons, and giving ATF more capacity, particularly in the border states, to really investigate these cases, we believe is an important issue.
Thank you. Mr. Aguirre or Mr. Steinberg, any final words? Or?
Well, I would like to thank you for this hearing. As I said at the beginning of my testimony, it is very important not only for us in Guerrero but for all the human rights movement in Mexico. And I just wanted to state that retaining the Merida funds because of the human rights requirements, it is very important as a way to state that the U.S. are worried because of the human rights situation in Mexico, and that the demands of the victims are true. So it is very important to be serious when it comes to check Mexico's advances in human rights situation, and not to look only to legal reforms. Mexican government is very good reforming laws, but it fails when it comes to implement that
results
law.
That we're looking for here.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I appreciate those words. I mean, they certainly resonate with me, and again, I hope that you will stay in close contact with this commission, and
thank you,
because we consider you a very valuable resource. So thank you.
Thank you,
Mr. Steinberg. Any final words?
Thank you. I echo my my peers' comments here that this is an absolutely essential hearing, and especially coming from a Congress that actually hasn't talked very much about the situation in Mexico. It makes a big difference to be able to raise concerns about these issues. In closing, I just wanted to bring up an issue that none of us had a chance to talk about today, but that all of us have encountered, which is that there is a general attitude in Mexico now that if you are a victim of a human rights abuse, that it was because you yourself were a criminal, that you had it coming. You know, a common refrain you hear from mothers of the disappeared who go to look for their sons with local prosecutors or police departments is, es porque andaba mal, because he was involved in something bad, you know, your son, that's why they took him. So there's no need to investigate. And often this is even said about human rights defenders in Mexico or journalists who suffer attacks. And so I think it is very important that the message come from the United States, and we do this through our conditions, but we also do it through hearings like this one, to say that the victims of the abuses that all of us are documenting are themselves not participants in organized crime, that many of them are innocent people, and that the act of prejudging them and saying that they're criminals before any investigation has happened is in fact endemic and indicative of a much bigger problem in Mexico, which we all have highlighted today, which is that these cases just aren't investigated. And that's, I think, the biggest obstacle ahead and the biggest work for Mexico, and where the U.S.'s pressure is most important. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank all of you. This has been a very excellent panel. It's been very informative to me and to the Commission. So I thank you for your comments, and we will stay in touch, and this hearing has come to an end. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.